When people think about Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe after World War II, they often imagine it as chaotic opportunism, Stalin simply grabbing whatever territory the Red Army could reach. But when I study the declassified documents and examine the systematic way the Soviets established control, what emerges is something much more sophisticated and chilling, a carefully designed template for imperial domination that was applied with remarkable consistency across every country the Soviets could reach. The Soviets didn't just conquer Eastern Europe. They perfected a replicable system for transforming independent nations into puppet states while maintaining the fiction that these countries remained sovereign. And understanding this template is crucial because variations of it are still being used today by authoritarian powers who want to control their neighbors without the costs and risks of direct annexation. Let me walk you through how the system worked because it represents one of the most successful examples of imperial control in modern history, and its influence extends far beyond the Cold War period in which it was developed. The first thing you have to understand is that the Soviets had studied how the Western Allies handled Italy after its surrender. They watched the Americans and British essentially take over Italian institutions while maintaining the pretense that Italy was a sovereign ally rather than an occupied territory. The Soviets decided they would apply the same approach in Eastern Europe, but much more systematically, and with no intention of ever allowing genuine independence to reemerge. But the Soviets also had advantages that the Western Allies didn't have in Italy. They had the massive Red Army presence that came from fighting their way across Eastern Europe to reach Berlin. They had the absolute turmoil that wars cause, which created opportunities to reshape entire societies while people were focused on basic survival. And they had war economies where centralized government control had become normalized as a wartime necessity. The Soviets leveraged all of these advantages to create permanent changes that would be much harder to implement in peacetime conditions. The template they developed had five essential components that were applied in every country they could reach. First, control the power ministries, defense and interior. If you control these two institutions, you control all the instruments of coercion in the country. You can eliminate opposition through force, and you can prevent any alternative power centers from emerging. This wasn't just about appointing Soviet advisors or friendly local officials. This was about restructuring these ministries so that they serve Soviet rather than national interests. Second, control the justice and information ministries. This gives you the ability to arrest or eliminate anyone who opposes you. And equally important, it gives you control over all the narratives about what's happening. You can rewrite laws to criminalize opposition activities. You can control newspapers, radio, and publishing to ensure that only approved stories reach the public. You can create legal justifications for whatever you want to do while making sure that alternative interpretations never gain public circulation. Third, control agriculture. In societies that were still largely agricultural, this meant controlling the means of survival for most of the population. But it also meant something more politically important: the ability to redistribute other people's lands. This was a powerful tool for buying loyalty from some groups while eliminating potential resistance from others. You could reward supporters with land taken from opponents. You could break up large estates that might serve as power bases for traditional elites. And you could eliminate kulaks, collaborators, and anyone else you wanted to get rid of while claiming you were just implementing land reform. Fourth, wrap the entire system in what I call the big lie, the fiction that this was all about liberation and democracy rather than imperial control. The Soviets presented themselves as anti-imperialist liberators fighting against Western imperialism, even while they were practicing the most successful imperialism of the 20th century. They held elections, but the outcomes were predetermined. They maintained the names and symbols of independent countries, but these countries had no real autonomy. They claimed to be spreading democracy and equality, while systematically eliminating anyone who might provide genuine democratic leadership. And fifth, create permanent institutional changes that would be very difficult to reverse. This meant not just controlling existing institutions, but fundamentally restructuring society in ways that would make restoration of the previous system nearly impossible. Collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industry, elimination of independent civil society organizations, creation of new educational systems that would indoctrinate future generations in Soviet ideology. But the Soviets also had a regional template that went beyond individual country control. They were thinking systematically about how to reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe to serve Soviet strategic interests. This involved ethnic cleansing on a massive scale. They were moving entire populations around, forcing Germans to live in Germany, Poles to live in Poland, Ukrainians to live in Ukraine. This wasn't just wartime displacement. This was deliberate policy designed to create ethnically homogeneous states that would be easier to control and less likely to harbor irredentist movements. They also engaged in what I call strategic state manipulation. They moved entire countries. Poland was shifted 200 kilometers to the west, deep into what had been German territory, so that the Soviet Union could absorb a large chunk of historic Polish lands. This wasn't normal behavior for a victorious power. You don't typically move entire countries unless you're implementing a systematic plan for regional control. And they created stepping stones for future expansion. Places like Kaliningrad, which gave them a strategic foothold in the heart of Europe. Moldova, which positioned them to influence the Balkans and control important river systems. They were thinking not just about consolidating control over what they had already taken, but about creating platforms for future expansion whenever opportunities might arise. Perhaps most cleverly, they worked to create divided neighboring states wherever possible. Germany divided between East and West, Korea divided between North and South, China struggling with the communist nationalist split. Vietnam eventually divided between North and South. If you can keep your neighbors fighting over their own borders and internal divisions, they can't organize effective resistance to your expansion, and they're more likely to seek your support in their internal conflicts. But here's what made the Soviet template so effective: they were patient and systematic about implementation. They didn't try to do everything at once, which might have triggered unified resistance. They implemented their control gradually, often over several years, allowing each stage to be normalized before moving to the next. They co opted local leaders wherever possible rather than simply imposing foreign administrators. They used local communist parties as instruments of Soviet policy while maintaining the fiction that these were indigenous political movements. And they were willing to use overwhelming force when necessary, but they preferred to create conditions where force wouldn't be needed. By controlling information and eliminating opposition leadership early, by buying support through land redistribution and economic opportunities, by creating new institutions that channeled political activity in approved directions, they made resistance seem futile and collaboration seem rational. The economic component of this template was particularly important. The Soviets didn't just want political control, they wanted to extract wealth from these countries to rebuild the Soviet Union after its devastating war losses. They dismantled entire factories and shipped them to the Soviet Union. They imposed trade relationships that were heavily skewed in Soviet favor. They used economic integration to create dependencies that would make political independence impossible even if political control were somehow loosened. But they wrapped this extraction in the language of socialist solidarity and economic development. They claimed they were helping these countries industrialize and modernize, even while they were systematically looting them. They established economic institutions like Comecon that were presented as alternatives to Western economic systems, but which actually functioned to channel Eastern European resources towards Soviet priorities. The informational component was equally sophisticated. The Soviets didn't just control what people could read or hear, they created alternative reality systems where Soviet actions were always defensive and beneficial, while Western actions were always aggressive and exploitative. They rewrote history textbooks, controlled university curricula, and created massive propaganda operations that presented the Soviet system as the wave of the future and Western democracy as a facade for capitalist exploitation. What makes this template so important to understand today is that variations of it are still being used. When I look at Russian behavior in places like Belarus, Kazakhstan, or the occupied territories of Ukraine, I see clear echoes of the Soviet template. Control the power ministries, control information, use economic leverage to create dependencies, maintain fictions of sovereignty while exercising real control, eliminate opposition leadership through legal and extra legal means. China has studied this template carefully and adapted it for modern conditions. Their approach in Hong Kong followed many of the same principles: gradually eliminate opposition institutions, control information flows, use economic incentives and pressures to encourage compliance, maintain legal fictions while exercising increasingly direct control. The tragedy of the Soviet template is not just that it was effective at establishing control, but that it was so destructive to the societies it controlled. By eliminating independent institutions, by crushing civil society, by creating economies dependent on external direction rather than internal innovation, the Soviet system left Eastern Europe economically and politically weakened for decades. The countries that escaped Soviet control earliest recovered most quickly, while those that remained under Soviet influence longest struggled most with the transition to democratic governance and market economies. Understanding the Soviet template also helps explain why Eastern European countries were so eager to join NATO and the European Union as soon as they had the opportunity. They had experienced firsthand what sophisticated imperial control looks like, and they recognized that their best defense against its return was integration into Western institutions that would make such control impossible to reestablish. The lesson from the Soviet playbook is that modern imperial control doesn't require direct annexation or obvious military occupation. It requires systematic control of key institutions, patient implementation over time, and sophisticated use of economic and informational tools to create dependencies and shape perceptions. It's a template that can be adapted to different circumstances and different technologies, but the basic principles remain remarkably consistent. And that's what makes it so dangerous and so important to understand.